when the speakers are talking. If you can shut your video off, that would be great. So then we have focus on the speakers. Just making sure. So
yes, it has started now.
Okay. So just welcome everyone to the event today. And so we're talking about casualisation of work in Ireland. So I'm Susan Feddix, one of the founding members of Women in Research Ireland. So to start this, we're going to launch a poll to ask question of the audience, and the question is, you should be able to see it. Are you in a temporary academic job contract in Ireland? So your options are either yes, no, or if you're not sure, you can say I don't know. And since this is the topic of the event today, we just like to have an idea of who the audience, how the audience is related to the topic in this. So I see there's some answers coming in. If you're just joining us, yeah, we're launching a poll. So I'll end it and then I'll show the results because it seems like everyone, oops, wait, sorry. Okay, and then now let's see, what do we have? So it seems there's a good bit. It's about 50-50. 54% are in temporary contracts and 46% are not, but everybody knows whether they are or not, so that's a good thing. So, okay, I'll stop sharing and then Valeska can start the event.
Okay, so just want to say good afternoon to all of you, and you're very welcome to this Women in Research event today. So the name of the event is Gender and Casualisation of Work in Irish Universities. I am Valeska Lima. I'm a committee member of Women in Research, and or WIRI for short. I'm also a member of the Irish Research Staff Association, which is an association representing research staff across Irish universities. And today I'm joined by the co-director and co-founder of WIRI, Susan Feddix, and also by my colleagues Kaf Corcoran and Anna Truzzi. They will be managing the Q&A and the chat, and also Arjman, she's going to be live tweeting the event today. So what's this about? What's our event today? So we want to promote the conversation on the rise of precarious academic employment in Ireland. Sorry, just my screen keeps popping up.
Sorry, you're muted, Valeska.
Yes, happening here. So this is a very important conversation because women in particular, they are overrepresented in increasing numbers of contingent academics who cannot find permanent employment. So while the casualisation of work means that increasing numbers of academics, both male and female, are now subject to the precarious, low-paid work, these work conditions, they are long endured mostly by women. So for example, according to a 2018 report from the Higher Education Authority in Ireland, while 51% of lecturers are women, just 24% of those they are professors. In contrast, 61% of those on part-time temporary contracts are women. So to understand more about these issues, we are joined today by Dr. Teresa O'Keefe. She's a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University College Cork, and also by Paolo Tumulci, who is a PhD student at the University of Limerick. So we will be taking questions from the audience, and at the end of the discussion, you can type your questions in the chat box during the event. And if you want to join this discussion on social media, you can use the hashtags research careers, job precarity, higher education. So this event is going to be recorded. So during the talk, perhaps you want to leave your camera off. So just to start with this conversation, I will now hand over to Dr. Teresa O'Keefe. She's a lecturer in UCC. She is doing research on gender and egalitarian social change. Her areas of expertise are feminist and social movements, gender and state violence, precarity and inequality in higher education. Before UCC, she was lecturing in equality studies at the School of Social Justice in UCD, and also in the School of Sociology Imanov. Teresa, she's going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes to address the audience, and you have the floor, Teresa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Valeska, for the warm welcome. It's great to be here today, and I'm so impressed with the turnout, especially for a topic on gender and precarity. Usually it draws a much smaller crowd, I have to say, but I think the topic has been garnering a fair bit of interest over the past couple of years. Hopefully that will lead to, I suppose, increased action around the topic as well. I'll just turn off my camera now and start sharing my screen. I've prepared some slides, if that's okay. Just take a second here. Okay, great. So the title of my talk today is, I suppose it's harking back to 1970s socialist and Marxist feminist analysis of work, work and the gender division of labor, because I think what we are seeing in relation to gender precarious work requires that analysis and that analogy. So I've called the paper The Housewives of the Academy, Gender and Precarious Academic Work in the Irish Higher Education Sector. And just to say, this is work that is done with Aline Courtois, Department of Education at University of Bath. This is a paper that we've kind of put together based on our own research, our joint research, our collaborative work in the topic, on the subject. So yes, back to the Housewives of the Academy. I suppose the term housewife and using of the term housewife is something that we have taken on for our piece that we wrote for Gender, Work and Organization as a frame in which to analyze or understand gender and precarious academic work. And it comes from Anne Oakley's 1995 piece, where she looks at the general division of labor within the academy and pointed out or theorized how women do the housework of the academy. And that's kind of what we're taking inspiration from today. So precarious work, what's new? Well, really, in a way, there's not a lot that is new when it comes to gender and precarious work. Precarious work itself is not new. It's work that has traditionally been done by women, by migrants. Precarity has been a long-standing feature of the university workplace. Cleaners, caterers, lecturers, researchers, admin, shop workers, and the university relies on precarious work to function across all different kind of sections of the university. Attention to academic precarity is somewhat new, I suppose, but especially that which pertains to gender. We have even less research on racialization of academic precarity and other dimensions of academic precarity as well, and how it intersects with other structural inequalities. And I suppose you could say that precarity now, even though it is something that has been long-standing as a form of work for women, it's perceived to be a crisis because it is, I suppose, arguably because it's affecting a more privileged sectors of the economy. Valeska referred to the Hea figures in her opening there. These are the 2021 figures from the Hea, and they are deceiving. They don't tell the entire picture, and I won't spend too much time on them. And that's partly because there is no central database within the Hea or even within individual universities that truly and accurately collect information on the full extent of precarious work, the forms of precarious work. For example, this hourly paid figure here that is cited, it's rather deceiving. Many universities don't have a central collection of hourly paid work, of the amount of hourly paid workers, for example, that's often held at local level. So one of the other interesting things to point out here is that the concentration of women in temporary contracts and in part-time work as well. And we see the leaky pipeline illustration up at the top. But again, I'll come back to that. And those are the general trends that I suppose we're all familiar with. The context of our work in this area comes from our own personal lived experience as precarious workers. I'm currently permanent, but permanent now after a very long, protracted, traumatic experience of being precarious. And as part of that experience, with Aline and with others, we started up, I suppose, a campaign, an activist group called Third Level Workplace Watch, where we wanted to agitate around the issue of precarious academic work. We located it within the broader struggles of neoliberalism. And we were really driven by the fact that there was no conversation being had in Ireland really at the time. There were some pockets in individual universities being organized by students, primarily PhD students, but there was no real conversation being had, and there was no existing data whatsoever for the extent of precarious work. We've had since some conservative estimates, and still though, there has been, I suppose, a continued institutional silence and a proliferation even further of casualized work. And it was in that context that we undertook this research, first as an outreach project as part of our work within Third Level Workplace Watch. And we wanted to find out what casualization looked like in Ireland. And then I suppose in the past year, myself and Aline, undertook a qualitative study to examine what we call the precarity penalty. What is the penalty for being a precarious academic? What does precarity look like for those who have been precarious for 5 or more years, for more than 5 years? And we're still in the midst of doing the analysis on that, and I'm going to refer to some of the preliminary results today. So just more generally, we're probably all familiar with this picture at the moment, but thanks to I suppose a lot of the news media have covered this. The journal study received a lot of attention. But one of the things that struck us when we first started doing our research, asking questions, and through this outreach study, is that precarity, academic precarity, is very much gendered. It predates austerity, it's normalized, and what we're seeing are very few exit points out of precarious work. There's a race to the bottom within and across institutions. Multiple new forms of precarious work are cropping up within the academic workplace all the time. This has led to not only isolation and marginalization, but real material consequences like fear, poverty, housing insecurity. And also it has consequences for an academic citizenship, academic freedom, and there are also issues in terms of union representation. Now, in terms of long-term precarity, what we're seeing is that there's an atypical progression. Precarity is now accepted. There are, I suppose, subjective views around the difference between good jobs versus bad jobs, but at the core of that is a common acceptance that progression is a good, visibility, the desire for equal pay for equal work, and paid time for work, and primarily research, because we see a siloing of teaching from research in a lot of precarious work. I won't take the time to go into all of these because I've probably taken too much time already, but just to say, I suppose one of the other overarching themes then that came out of our study on long-term precarity is that undoubtedly we are seeing a sharpening of gender inequalities both in the workplace and in the home as a result of academic precarity. So We know that there is a concentration of women in the most tenuous forms of non-permanent work, but also work that is permanent, but still precarious. So within our work, in order to chart the different types of precarious work, we saw, for example, 0 hours contracts, someone who was permanent, but tied to an institution and not sure how many hours they get from year to year. We also found that women were trapped in the most exploitative forms of precarious work, work that earns less than the minimum wage, comes with no job security or sick leave or maternity leave or other entitlements. They also tended to be trapped longer in precarious work than men. And this was exacerbated by class, racism, ageism, ableism, and citizenship status as well. And some of the most acute, severe cases of precarity were all women in our research. These were women who were doing precarious work, the most exploitative forms of precarious work, for 10 plus years across multiple institutions. They were often, their income was often supplemented by social welfare, which added another layer of bureaucracy and work and negotiation to their daily lives. And this work was often hourly paid. So I suppose we use this frame then of housework to try and understand and theorize this from a feminist perspective. And what we can see is that there's clearly a feminization of precarious academic work at play here. As women are increasingly entering this field of academic work, women are, the work is devalued, it's low paid, there's this race to the bottom that we mentioned at the very start. It's insecure, there's very little respect or recognition, and it resembles the work that women do within the informal economy that we know from other sectors that's been longstanding. Women's work in the academy resembles their unpaid work, particularly within the home. It's invisibilized. It's not important for career progression. It's less prestigious. And we also see an entrenchment of the gender division of labor. And this is really, I suppose, made even more acute by the coronavirus pandemic. So pastoral care is a significant feature of women's precarious academic work, and indeed women's academic work more generally. And this resembles gendered care work. So they're at the front lines, front-facing work, dealing with students, interacting with large groups of students, doing the care work and the minding of students. And we also see that women's private care roles also collide with the assumption that research is done within one's own time. So if you're an hourly paid lecturer, you're not getting paid to do research. And the assumption is that if you're an academic, you will do research, but you do it for free and in your own time. And this collides with this masculine model upon which academia is based, this assumption that there's somebody in the home doing all the things that make the home function to allow the man to do his work, beyond, say, outside of traditional working hours, but beyond, say, your 8 hours a day as well. Women reported differences in how male colleagues who were precarious treated them. We had women telling us about men who were precarious getting assigned, say, getting given better types of work that related to their thesis, as opposed to work that was types of teaching that was maybe devalued within their departments or within their disciplines. And there, a number of women reported that their male colleagues who were precarious were often leaving a lot of the bulk of the non-prestigious work for women to do. So when tutoring together or teaching together, letting the women answer emails, for example, or doing the pastoral care or administrative work within a module. And as I say, women were trapped post-PhD for longer in the most exploitative forms, trapped within hourly paid work. And we see then a gender divide emerging between teaching and research, where teaching is paid, albeit poorly, and research then becomes unpaid labor. And this has, I suppose, significant consequences for women who are of course then primarily responsible for care work within the home. This is a quote from one of our research participants, which really shows the intersection of care inequalities, poverty, and gender. She's a white working class woman, she's a single mother, early 50s, and she says that she feels that her age and her gender are against her. Because she has caring responsibilities as well, she just doesn't have enough time. And by enough time, she means enough time to do the work, the research work that's expected to be done in her own time in order to get on, to make herself, I suppose, competitive, or, competitive there in square quotes, to get more secure work. So she doesn't have enough time or the headspace to use it. It's like your mental energy is spent worrying about bills, keeping food on the table, making sure you got shoes for your kids and stuff like that. It's kind of like, where is the next money coming from? Who's going to pay the oil bill? How am I going to pay the mortgage? And when you think about the process of writing and doing research and the mental clarity that it takes, this is in contradiction with the demands that women face in their everyday life when we think about how gender is organized within the home and within the workplace as well. And another quote here which illustrates how unpaid care work can interfere with unpaid academic work. So this is a white middle-class woman, single, in her late 30s, and she's talking about her mother who has been ill and the division of labor around taking care of her. And because she was an hourly paid worker, it was assumed that she really didn't have to work, that she was flexible, that she was always there, that she doesn't have anything on. And she says that this means that the journal that she is editing is a year behind. She's now revising it a year later, and she doesn't initially say that this is a precarious work issue, but it quite clearly is. She says women have a greater burden, and that can mean that you're not always doing the stuff that you should be doing to get you up on the ladder. So just kind of some indicative findings, I suppose, as we're analyzing then this, or indicative conclusions. There are real consequences, I suppose, for this the gendering of precarious work, for women. It has implications for research and creates difficulties in terms of establishing a research profile. The teaching itself is labor intensive, and they have little value or limited access rather to valued administrative work, things that build up the CV in order to make one appear that they are in the running for a permanency or more secure work. And care work in the home impacts the ability to do the work that's expected to be done to progress into secure work. There is also delayed access to the bottom of the academic ladder, and we see that leaky pipeline and this gap that we know exists within the senior ranks of the universities, within higher education. And that is partly explained by the fact that women are working across multiple institutions while they're precarious. They're starting at the bottom of the ladder each time they go into a new institution. And so they could very well have 12 years of academic experience under their belt, but they're starting at the same point as someone who has just come out of their PhD, for example. And this means that the benchmarks for promotion are unattainable because precarity is stigmatized. And often then we're seeing career regression and not progression. This then has consequences for gender inequality, even beyond the university. First of all, men and women too are advancing through the senior ranks of academia through the labor of precarious women.
Hi, Teresa. You have just 1 minute left.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valeska. It's my last slide, so I'll be very quick. We see increased vulnerabilities to sexual violence in the workplace. A number of our respondents reported that. Poverty, financial and housing insecurity. And this creates economic dependence on their partners and often traps them within relationships. Women have reported that in our study. There's delays in starting a family, if they're able to have family at all. And there's a real concern about not having a pension when they get older and being in poverty. And of course, Athena Swan is kind of struggling to catch up with that. I think we can talk about that in the discussion. And I suppose there's a lack of an intersectional institutional analysis to be added, to be sufficiently adopted as well. I'll just leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions to elaborate on that in the discussion.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Teresa. This was so insightful. I think just taking note of the main points, and I think it's very necessary for us to understand what's the extension of job precarity, and your research is definitely going to help to fill this gap. The feminist approach makes a lot of sense because, yes, I do agree it's a reflection of women's work that's usually undervalued. And in relation to the lack of data, this is something that's extremely important. We don't know the full extension of the problem because there is no proper data collection on that. And yeah, so thank you so much. Now we move on to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Paola Tumulti. She is a PhD student at the Department of Work and Employment Studies at the University of Limerick. Her current research examines the employment relationship of early career researchers in a context of imposed austerity in Ireland. She will have 10 to 15 minutes, and you have the floor. Paola, thank you.
Thank you. Can you enable the screen sharing?
Yeah, I think it's enabled already.
It's disabled. Not for me. Sorry. It's disabled.
Yes. Go ahead.
There. Okay. Okay, just bear with me for one moment. Okay, so thanks, Valeska, and thanks for asking me to participate in this, and thanks to everybody for joining in. Just going to give a little bit of background before I get started. My presentation is going to be based on some research I've just conducted. So between July and mid-October of this year, I conducted a survey on the employment relationship of early career academics. Now, I looked at early career academics in the UK and Ireland, but for today, I'm just going to look at the results from the Irish participants. Early career, when I talk about early career academic, I'm also including early career researchers. And one of the things that I discovered at the beginning, that it was extremely difficult to actually define what an early career academic was. So for the purpose of this research, what I have defined an early career academic as being somebody who is employed in higher education institute as either a lecturer or a researcher who has completed a PhD, post 7 years completed a PhD, or who is registered as a PhD while lecturing and researching. And I've also given people the opportunity to self-define as an early career academic. So to start, what I'm going to look at here briefly what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to look at data related to Ireland, and this is data specific, just an review of the analysis, a quick look at what I've researched. So first, I'm going to start off by looking at the overview of Ireland in total. Then I'm going to look at 3 different contracts of employment. So I'm going to look at permanent and continuing contracts and combined with the CID. I'm going to look at fixed term contracts, casual contracts, and concluding comments. And I'm going to introduce all of that data. And it's related to the Irish participants who responded. So in Ireland, we had a total of 243 respondents. Now, not every respondent answered every question, but in this, it worked out at a proportion of 62% female to 30% male, which meant that there was an overwhelming response from female early career academics. Also, 23% of those who replied were registered for a PhD. The age group varied, but 40% were between the age of 30 and 40, and it was spread across all faculties. So you can see from here, from this pie chart, that there was a big response from those in science and engineering, in humanities and arts, who totaled 39%. And then there was an even spread between science and engineering, medical and health, and law and business. And there was a low turnout from education. In the academy, as you know, the roles are divided into 3 specific areas. So you have teaching and research, research only, and teaching only. And the findings here, the response here, there was 45% in the teaching and research area, 35% in research, and 20% in teaching only contracts. Looking at the different type of contracts and different issues that were reported, there was 23% of participants were part-time, reported work on part-time basis. 19% have one other job in higher education, and 6% have reported that they've got more than one other job in higher education. 55% of those who responded had no dependent children, and there was a high trade union membership with 40%, which was above the national average. So moving on then and looking at permanent and continuing contracts and contracts indefinite duration. I decided to combine these because of time constraints today, and they totaled 29% of participants. That was 71 people reported being on one or other of these contracts. And of that, 78% were on teaching and research contracts. Now, what's interesting with this, excuse me for a moment. What's interesting with this is that no participant who was on a permanent or continuing contract reported being on a research only contract. But when we look at the contract of indefinite duration, there were 6 respondents who were employed on a contract of indefinite duration on a research only contract. Then again, looking at it on the teaching perspective, the majority of those had secured a contract of indefinite duration, and the majority of those were female. Thinking about a contract of indefinite duration and securing a contract of indefinite definition, one particular participant commented, while he's on a CID now, it took 10 years on multiple contracts, and those contracts often ran concurrently. Again, with this particular type of contract, there was an equal spread across all disciplines and again across all age groups. And 50% of those who were responded on this reported having no dependent children. 48% were members of a trade union, which again is a very high level of trade union membership. And a small but a significant number of people expressed a desire to leave academia despite their permanent status. And signaling difficulties, one participant who was employed on a contract commented, even when ECAs get a CID or a permanent contract, many of us are working above and beyond what is required in an attempt to get above the bar. So thinking about that, and I looked at some of the attitudinal questions here on this point, and thinking about overwork. Of the participants, 85 participants either agreed or strongly agreed with the comment, I never seem to have enough time to get everything in my job done. And then 93% agreed with the comment, I regularly work extra unpaid hours to meet work demands. Looking now at fixed term contracts, and this was the area which generated the most results. So 47% participants were on fixed term contracts. 63% of these participants were on research-only contracts, and these were actually surprised. The majority of these on research-only contracts were female respondents. Almost 70% in this category were in the 30 to 40 age group. And again, they were spread across all disciplines. So in humanities, arts, and social sciences, there was 40%. In medical and health, there was 22%. And in science and engineering, there was 19%. In this category, a very high proportion reported having no dependent children at 69%. And then looking at different contracts and how people were employed, 58% said that they were employed on 3 or more contracts, and 17% were employed on a part-time basis. 25% reported that they were employed on 1 or more additional jobs. In this category, there was 30% members of a trade union. And this was the lowest in the category, but it's still quite a high the lowest trade union membership, but it was still quite a high number. But one participant who was on a fixed term contract commented with regard to organising in higher education for people who are on fixed term contracts, said that I think research staff are vulnerable in that given the fast turnover of research staff who are generally on shortish fixed term contracts, it's difficult for research staff to organise to represent their interests well. In this group, 14% indicated that they would not like to spend their whole career in higher education. Referring to the system generally, another participant made the comment that the current system works best for the HEIs and funding bodies, and they're the only stakeholders consulted regarding frameworks for early career researchers. When asked about workload and unpaid labour, 85% either agreed or strongly agreed with the comment, with the statement, I never seem to have enough time to get everything done in my job. And then in the 81% either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, I regularly work extra unpaid hours to meet work demands. The last contractual area that I'm going to look at are casual contracts. Now, this was a combination of temporary contracts, of hourly paid contracts, of general temporary contracts. And this consisted of 17% of the participants. That was 42 people. Of this, 83% were female. And again, of this, 45% were on teacher-only contracts, and that again was 84% were female, were working on those particular type of contracts. It was distributed again across all age groups, but it was dominant in the 36 to 45 age group. And again, it was across all faculties, but dominant in humanities and law and business. 52% of people in this category reported having no dependent children, and 67% were part-time. Again, in this category, it was dominated by female participants. In this category, there was 38% who were members of a trade union. And again, 14% said that they weren't interested in spending their full career employed in higher education. One particular participant who was employed on an hourly paid contract made the comment, precarious working conditions are dangerous for the mental health of early career researchers. The competition for funding is also destroying scholarship in my field. So when asked about their workload and unpaid labour, 72% agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that they never had enough time to get everything done in the job. And then 92% either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, I regularly work extra unpaid hours to meet work demands. So just a couple of concluding comments here. There is, without a doubt, a prevalence of precarity across all areas of higher education in in Ireland. All faculties were represented in each area and all age groups. Precarity is gendered, where women are more likely to be employed in casual and teaching-only contracts than their male counterparts. There's an excessive workload in unpaid labour, and it's common issues across the majority of participants, irrespective of their contract type. And finally, there is a high trade union membership despite the transient nature of precarious academic labour. And that concludes all I have to say. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so
did I leave somebody out?
yeah, can you stop sharing? Do you see the option?
Okay, bear with me.
I don't see it here.
It just says new share.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So Paula, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That
you.
was very relevant. I think so much information and so much you can use. So I think for me the most interesting point was about how we can define who is an early career researcher. This is a discussion that we keep having. So, for example, what's a postdoc? How we can define what they are and what exactly they do, and especially when we're speaking about the number of academics who are in unions. I found that very relevant too. At some cohorts, it was up to 48%, which is relatively high, I would say. And especially because organizing when you are in a job in a precarious contract is extremely challenging. Academics are usually in a very vulnerable position. So this is one of the main challenges for the Irish Research Staff Association. And this is something that we have been trying to do in terms of put academics in touch with events like this, so we can have these important discussions. So thank you so much for your presentation today. Now we have a few questions from the audience, and I will hand over to Susan and Kath. They will be organizing that.
Great, thank you, Valeska. This first question is for Teresa. It's from Maeve O'Sullivan. Thank you, Teresa, for a great presentation. Do you have information on the gender statistics for academics in Irish HEs by faculty?
No, we don't. Again, the HEA itself supplies some rough differentiation, but part of the problem is that the institutions themselves don't collect this data. So basically what we're generating here, what Paula is generating, is perhaps some of the most accurate that we're going to get, the closest kind of picture. In terms of, I suppose, the breakdown, you'll notice this in Paula's and as well as my own, there's a tendency for the arts and humanities to be overrepresented. And I mean, I wonder, is that to do with, you know, the nature of our own networks and who we're able to reach to do the research, but also, you know, I think more generally, the structure within the sciences for research and teaching looks a bit different and can be exploitative in different ways and gendered in different ways as well. But for some reason, they are not as representative in our studies, in both of our studies, even though we tried different ways in which to engage those different disciplines. But I don't know if Paula wants to add anything there as well. But again, the existing data is very limited. I mean, the institutions have, and the HEA and the IUA have a vested interest in not collecting this information. And there has been active resistance to start collecting this information within institutions because for obvious reasons, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the idea of reaching people is very important, how you can reach people. My data has also looked at the UK, and I've got about the same number from the UK. So it's going to be interesting to see if they're spread across the same disciplines, if it's an issue in the Irish context or if it's an issue generally, reaching different people in different faculties, definitely.
Thank you. And the next question is regarding references. So first of all, thank you so much. Naming the inequality is important. And then will slides be made available and reference sources? Also, could you share the reference to the Loxley paper?
I saw that from Aileen there. Aileen, I can send you on a copy if you want. I have your email address, but I'm happy to put any links in here into the chat afterwards. I won't be able to do it while we're talking because I can't walk and chew gum at the same time, but yeah, I can send on the link here and post it into the chat and send on the paper to you, Aileen.
Hi, we have one more question. This one is for Paula, and was asked from Lorna Rowe. And here's the question: in terms of reporting on precarious staff, do the panel have any ideas what data to ask for example, about precarious staff that can be hidden within data presented as FTE? I'm interested in tracking people rather than getting cross-sectional snapshots. Do HR departments have staff IDs to facilitate this tracking of people in out of contract? And are there specific questions we should be asking our employers in terms of staff in precarious contracts?
Data is very hidden. It's very hard to know how to find things, where to go to get the information. The information is not readily available. So that's not something that I could answer. I don't know if Teresa could answer that.
I mean, myself and Aline have been trying to figure out how to get at these questions, how to get universities to answer these questions. And I know Maria Delaney tried too with the FOIs with the universities as part of the study she did for the journal. And I suppose the first question to ask is how many non-permanent staff are under employment. But the problem is that, I mean, in terms of the HEA data, it is referencing core funding. And we all know within institutions, a lot of work is paid beyond core funding, and a lot of the kind of research buyouts, a lot of hodgepodge funds that allow a lecturer to get a PhD student to cover their class are stuff that's done kind of off the books, under the radar, or just not having to be centrally reported. We know when JobsBridge was active, a number of institutions, a lot of institutions and a lot of departments drew on JobsBridge for academic work. And so that isn't recorded as formal employment within kind of the university structures either. So there are questions, I suppose, for me that relate not just to the classification of contracts that we're seeing and how they're reported, but also the invisible work and the unpaid work that is unpaid. So a lot of times we know in one institution, in one science department discipline, that it is common practice for PhD students to teach entire module for free, and that's considered as part of training. And that's problematic in the first instance because PhDs, researchers are treated as students and not workers. So a lot of the work that they do for the university is not considered work, it's branded as training. So I guess there are a whole series of questions that need to be asked, and not just one, in order to get at that answer of trying to document the full extent of precarious work.
Thank you very much.
Great. The next question is from Paola Ravetti. It's got two parts. Thanks so much to both panelists and Valeska for chairing. I would like to ask, one, if you know of any casualized colleagues-led initiative that is being currently organized. And two, perhaps this one is for Teresa, how do you see the role of permanent staff members in supporting or being part of the struggle? Thank you.
I don't know of any initiative underway, and I think permanent staff, yet it is necessary, but permanent staff are also under an awful lot of pressure. In higher education, I don't know what Teresa thinks about that.
I suppose the most exciting thing that I'm seeing at the moment is the organization of postgraduate workers. We have the Postgraduate Workers Alliance now, which has a chapter, I think, on every campus in Ireland. And they are, I suppose, creating a national conversation around PhD workers' rights, which is, I think, is fantastic. There are different smaller initiatives that are happening, I suppose, in different corners and different pockets. I know that some institutions have localized, I suppose, campaigns like precarious workers committees. And I think there is scope actually to create something bigger. This is something that I'm constantly trying to kind of stimulate in the different initiatives that I'm involved in. But the problem is, I suppose that, and we found this with our work in third level workplace watch, is that for precarious workers, there is also the issue of mobility and having to go from institution to institution, and therefore working in an institutional based kind of model of organizing that doesn't actually work for precarious workers. And this goes back to something that was research that was done in the States around kind of a metro model of organizing that worked better for say contingents for precarious academic workers, because it was built not attached to, the model was based not attached to a campus per se, but in terms of a city or geographical location. So there is nothing that is national that encompasses all types of precarious work at the moment, but I think there's certainly scope for it. And in terms of how permanent colleagues can, I suppose, do more, first of all, we have to interrogate our own practices. We have to look at what powers we have within our local decision-making levels and departmental meetings when we're applying for research funding, buyouts, looking at pay scales, all those sorts of things, putting pressure within the unions to prioritize precarious work and the plight of precarious workers, but also creating space within union structures for precarious workers. There's still difficulties around that. And yeah, I suppose those are the main things. I mean, the biggest issue is within the trade unions. For many precarious workers, you're sitting alongside your manager within, so if you're a member of IFOOT, like I am, my boss has the same status within the union as I do, who's going to the same meetings, airing the same grievances. And that's an issue. So there needs to be a dedicated space, even within the trade unions, for precarious workers to organize. So yeah, lots of ideas, but would like to see more around that too.
Academia is very based on building networks which are personal relationships. So that it can be quite difficult to be seen as being a troublemaker. The concern, even for permanent employees, especially for permanent employees who want to continue to build their career, and the fear that they'll have that if they say the wrong thing, they'll fall out with the wrong person and they won't progress their career. So there's a lot of people struggling with a lot of difficulties, a lot of issues in higher education.
And just kind of picking up on that point, Paula, this has come up in our research too, where women were afraid to be seen as being the difficult women. So not only being critical within academia, but also that added dimension, that kind of gender dimension, that women themselves would be branded as difficult if they looked for their rights and entitlements.
Thank you. So many more points to make, but we have time for one final question before we wrap up. So the question comes from Linda, and it's for Paula. The question being, I'm surprised at the membership rates of trade unions. I wonder if the lack of a definition relates to the lack of proactive action from trade unions. Have you talked to trade unions to get stats or their work outputs in relation to these members? And Paula, we just have a few seconds to answer this before we have to wrap up.
I haven't spoken to the trade union yet at this stage about stats that they have. The difficulty, there's a high level of membership. It's above the national membership, which I think is about 25%. So there's definitely a desire to engage and to organise in that trade union, but I don't actually have any statistics from the trade union at this stage.
Yeah, so thank you so much for answering those questions. I think if we had time, we just keep this going on and on. So because there is so much to discuss about this. So before we close, we have a final poll question for you. So Susan, if you can launch the poll now.
Yes, just to see how everyone has done today. The question is, did you learn something new about casualization of work in Irish universities today? The hot topic of the day. So your answers are yes, no, or if you're not sure, that's fine as well. So a lot of the answers are coming in. Did you learn something new about casualization of work in Irish universities today? So I'll see, closing the poll now that there's a few more coming in. Okay, so close, and then I will show that it seems we have 100%, fortunately, that everyone has learned something today. It can be a bit stressful, but at least we're learning the truth, so thanks.
Well, this is great. Thank you for attending our event today. That was a very enlightening discussion. We want to thank our both panelists, Teresa and Paula, and also thanks to Women in Research Ireland Committee for help with this event. Please have a look at our website, Women Research website, and sign up to our newsletter. And also for those of you who are based in Irish universities, do check out the webpage of the Irish Research Staff Association in case you want to get in touch about at least some of those issues that we're discussing here today. So thank you a lot. I will stop the recording, and goodbye.
I also say, and stop the transcript.
Yes.